When the Great War shook the world, unleashing a level of firepower never seen before, the limits of the human brain were stress-tested in an unprecedented way. Under the constant rain of artillery, people broke. Their minds scrambled in a way bravery could not defend from. Misunderstood and battered under the cruel treatment of doctors who didn't understand their condition. The men who lived and suffered under a rain of artillery knew true hell. This is the horrifying, tragic story of shell shock. Living under bombardment. Shell shock, combat fatigue. Many names have been used to define what we now know as combat fatigue. But what happened to soldiers during the First World War was a different level of trauma, so specific to this apocalyptic conflict to merit consideration as its own, almost separate condition. World War I was, almost certainly, the most horrifying war ever fought from the point of view of the frontline soldier. A combination of historical and technological milestones worked together in order to create the most terrifying battlefields in history. When, during the first weeks of the war in August 1914, the French front unexpectedly collapsed under the First German offensive, the world truly thought that the end of the conflict was already there. In any other conflict, the cavalry would have been unleashed, turning the French retreat into a riot. Wars before the Great War lasted years, but were usually filled with tedious marches, endless waiting, punctuated by days of furious battle. Now an endless onslaught was about to devour the soldiers sent to the front line. As weapon technology advanced, World War I infantry was able to unleash a level of firepower capable of wiping out any chasing cavalry in an instant, even after suffering terrible defeats. With nothing faster than a man able to take the field, armies were incapable of outmaneuvering each other or running their enemy down. With cavalry being rendered tactically useless, the world would have to wait for tanks to be developed and used correctly in order to again see rousing, complete victories. Until then, war became an insane theater of armies retreating and chasing at the same speed. The defeated party would simply find a new set of prepared defenses, and the endless game would repeat again. The recipe for a deadly stalemate was complete. Technology had made infantry capable of unleashing terrible firepower. Machine guns and advanced bolt-action rifles were capable of cutting down hundreds of men in an instant. But they weren't the rulers of the battlefield. World War I had only one true king: artillery. Guns such as the Big Bertha, a naval cannon brought onto land and capable of firing 420mm shells, were able to shake the earth, reducing mighty fortresses to rubble and sending trees up in the sky with a single blast, like twigs in the wind. These incredible artillery pieces were powerful, but what truly turned the war into a hellish hellscape was the number of guns deployed. At the beginning of the Battle of Verdun, the German army opened up with more than 1,200 artillery pieces. Around 60 million shells were fired in the 10 months of the battle. Many among those fighting lost their minds under this storm of steel. Rolling barrages, artillery bombardments, suicidal charges all quickly became routine during the First World War. Soldiers fighting on the front line became victims of lethal poison gas, killed the same way one would eradicate an ant colony. Men subjected to these conditions, forced not only to fight, but to live on the front line, huddled in the trenches, had to face their own mortality constantly. Their nervous system was battered by the sound of powerful explosions going on and on at all times. Every second a shell could fall on them and their friends. People could be talking and laughing and be maimed screaming a second later. Those who survived the trenches came back home bringing the horrors of war with them, and some were broken to an almost irreversible degree, bringing hell back home. The symptoms of shell shock were noticed by most armies after the very first few encounters of the war, but it was in the British Army that the phenomenon was first given attention. The term shell shock was born on the battlefield, but the first to officially recognize it was Dr. Charles Samuel Myers of the British Army Medical Corps in 1915, who wrote about it in The Lancet. In the article, Dr. Myers analyzed different cases of soldiers suffering from shell shock. One of them survived 6 consecutive shells exploding around him, while another was buried alive for 18 hours when the trench collapsed on him during an artillery barrage. Myers brought to light different men with different experiences, presenting similar, incapacitating symptoms. Those suffering from shell shock were often described by other soldiers as dead men who forgot to die. Incapacitating tremors, paralysis, irritational bursts of aggression, and splitting headaches were common among the patients. Anxiety dominated their life, making many among them susceptible to loud noises. Some lost their hearing or became completely mute, almost catatonic. Many were completely unable to function, both as soldiers and as normal members of society. In order to explain this newly discovered condition, doctors chose to believe it was caused by the concussive power of artillery. To them, these symptoms could only be explained by a physical wound. Explosions were, after all, omnipresent during every engagement of the Great War. A simple way to explain shell shock was a consequence of continuous concussions. As new cases kept being discovered, though, many among them were found not to have been hit by artillery at all, leading the medical staff to abandon this theory. PTSD wasn't a new human experience. Many had suffered from this condition in the endless series of wars fought during the bloody march of human history. At the time, those whose mind was shaken to its core were simply dismissed as generally crazy, even possessed, their numbers too little to lead anyone to take the phenomenon seriously. Shell shock quickly became commonplace in all armies engaged in the Great War, spreading with the speed of a deadly pandemic. The British Army recognized more than 13,000 cases by 1915, and it is estimated that at least 250,000 people suffered shell shock during the war, both among officers and soldiers. These numbers, already high, could probably be low compared to reality, as many suffering were never taken seriously. Military authorities, as the greatest war the world had ever known progressed, weren't inclined to be sensitive to the plea of the common man, and different definitions were often used to define those whose mind was broken by war. Cowards, deserters, traitors. An unknowing number of these men were not seen as ill, but simply as criminals, and were punished accordingly. Hundreds of men already suffering were condemned to harsh punishments, even death, by firing squad for the crime of cowardice. A man, in the view of the high commands of all belligerent nations should live, fight, and die by the orders given to him by his superior officer. And in a world where mental illness was not only poorly understood, but often seen as a convenient trick not to do one's duty, to be unable to function was a sin punishable by death. Many who suffered from PTSD symptoms were forgotten, never to be officially diagnosed. Many more died in the trenches before being able to return to the rear, their story lost forever in craters filled with poisoned water. In the eyes of many, often fueled by nationalistic fanaticism, to suffer from shell shock was proof of a weak man. Only those prone to cowardice, pathetic men who deserved everything they got, could fall to this kind of illness. Many among the officers, obsessed with antiquated concepts of gallantry and bravery, saw shell-shocked soldiers under their command as a stain on their own personal honor and punished them accordingly. To be mentally ill was to be weak, and to be weak was to be a sinner. When World War I started, no one could have predicted how long it would have lasted, and especially the incredible amount of resources, both material and human, necessary to fight it. As the trenches drained the lifeblood of the most powerful nations in the world, as their younger generations were slaughtered, manpower quickly became a key problem to solve. Both the medical staff and the military quickly started to take the shell shock problem seriously, as the men they were so quick to discard before became a precious resource. Shorter shifts at the front were implemented by most armies in the later stages of the war, as giving relief to the troops usually meant that they could be made combat-ready sooner. For those who still had their mind rattled by the onslaught, treatment was now available. But they would come to regret this ostensible mercy. From torture to treatment. Around 40% of British casualties in the Battle of the Somme were men who suffered from shell shock. Numbers were rapidly piling up, and the top brass was afraid that the plague of mental illness would devour their army. Something had to be done, and resources were finally used to study the phenomenon and find treatment options. As the battles of 1916 continued, shell shock was recognized as a mental illness, instead of a physical wound. This was only apparently a positive change, as in practice, it meant that soldiers who didn't show immediate symptoms could be considered legally healthy, ready to be deployed on the front lines again. Doctors were now hard-pressed to find ways to treat these symptoms in any way possible. Many of those suffering were subjected to inhuman experimentations. At first, soldiers were beaten down and screamed at by their own medical staff, as it was theorized that the soldier had to be forced into overcoming his own cowardice. But the low rate of success soon brought out new types of horrors. Electroshock therapy was heavily used to bring a shocked soldier back to full combat readiness. Dr. Louis Yealand, who had unsuccessfully tried to use shocks to the throat of mute patients in order to cure them, declared a success rate of almost 100% using shocks on shell shock patients. Such terrible torture was administered again and again until the soldier was ready to do anything not to be shocked again. Many were sent back to the front with lasting damage from the shocks, from which they would suffer for the rest of their lives. The only metric for success was to be able to again use a soldier, meaning that any action capable of delivering this result was considered to be fair game. In 1916, medical pioneers began trying a new approach in the treatment of shell shock. While sending the soldier back to the front lines remained the primary objective, some doctors believed that the tough, inhumane methods used by those who preceded them was only making things worse. Shell shock needed a psychological treatment and a softer approach. Dr. William Rivers, working at Craig Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh, was among the first to try to truly help those suffering from what we know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Rivers, believing self-preservation to be the driving force of the human mind, and that by talking, digging out repressed memories in the patient, he could convince them that their condition was not permanent. This led to a journey of healing and psychoanalysis, during which Dr. Rivers would teach his patients the basics of his science in order to help them help themselves. Results spoke for themselves, and soon the softer approach chosen by Rivers became dominant in the rehabilitation of those suffering from shell shock. No way out. In time, the treatment of shell shock evolved, becoming more humane and effective. But this fact didn't save most of those whose mind was battered into submission. In the end, between 1914 and 1918, an entire generation was thrown into the wood chipper of war, returning home as different people. Some never could overcome their illness, while others, declared cured, returned as depressed individuals, even turning suicidal a few years later. While Dr. Rivers was able to forge the highest standard of treatment for shell shock, the war was still raging, and few resources were going to be spent to apply these methods in a systematic manner. Many other doctors attempting their own solution to the PTSD problem, and their approach, while based in psychology, was still sadistic by our modern standards. Isolation was often inflicted on shell shock victims. Solitude and a lack of stimulation filled their days in order to, theoretically, calm their nerves. But sometimes they were pushed to confront their triggers and fears in the most brash, direct way possible. Exposure to loud noises was often used, as many of the soldiers still could not handle them after living under bombardment. In 1917, the British Army, the only one to officially recognize the existence of shell shock, banned the use of the word completely, stepping back in line with the rest of Europe. This was not done in order to adapt to the evolving understanding of the condition still developing in medical circles, but in order to erase shell shock from the legal reasons that would allow soldiers not to be sent to the front line. Even in 1918, Dr. Yelland, still convinced of his terrifying methods, wrote that shell shock was simply a loss of manhood, a weakness that could be defeated only by bravado and courage. As the Great War ended and the pressure to keep the flow of manpower moving subsided, the understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder finally started growing in the whole medical community. When World War II began, the psychological effects of combat on the frontline soldiers was a recognized fact. New words came into use, such as war neurosis or psychiatric collapse, and a whole set of new drugs was used to try and treat those who broke under the pressure of war. Needless to say, even after all this work and advancement, none of it truly worked. 40% of all those discharged from duty by the American Army during World War II were suffering from PTSD. The tension between the Army's need to retain its personnel and the necessity of its long, difficult psychological work in order to help those suffering from this condition still exists today, and was alive and well when the Vietnam War ended, unloading another traumatized generation in the streets of the United States. Shell shock, or PTSD, is now deeply understood and mostly treatable, but can still be found among the veterans of war today. The ancient Greeks believed that Phobos, god of fear, ruled the battlefield, and he still does today. Vietnam, just like World War I, showed the world a unique type of horror. Fear and trauma were used as weapons by master craftsmen capable of turning a few pieces of wood into a deadly contraption. If you'd like to know about the horrifying traps used in Vietnam, click on the next video, and remember to subscribe for more.